Hey everybody, welcome. My name is Nick. We are glad that you are spending a little time hanging out here with us today. We want to welcome all of you on Facebook and YouTube for making some time here today. And we want to welcome you to this online experience. Right now, this Sunday, we aren't meeting in person at all. So there's probably more people online at this moment than normal, and so if you want to say hi to the people watching this with you, you can drop a hello down in the comments and say hi to people around you. That would be great. Now, if you want to find out a little bit more about this church in particular, what this group is that you've stumbled upon, you can go to our website, findpathways.com, and we have our core values listed here at the bottom of the screen. And these are things that, as kind of, well, we like to see ourselves as traveling companions. We don't have all the answers. We're kind of all headed in a certain direction, but some of us have been traveling on this road longer than others. And as we make this journey together, there's a few things that we've decided we're going to stop and value along the way. And so we've got those core values listed down there, but if you want to read a little bit more about kind of what we mean by those things, you can go to our website and learn a little bit more about them. And I know it's weird, especially if you are kind of a little bit at all skeptical about religion, to stumble onto a church and be like, who are these guys really, right? And it's kind of hard to just describe ourselves in a quick little intro like this, like, this is who we are. So maybe perhaps reading a little bit more online might be helpful to get a sense of who we are. Obviously, I'd imagine just spending some time around us would probably give you the greatest insight into who we are. But we usually do like to describe ourselves with a couple words if this is helpful. The first word we use to describe ourselves is cautious. We are a group that are a little bit skeptical about organized religion. Many of us have grown up in religious contexts or been around religion for periods of our life. And while we know that religion can be used in very positive, helpful, good ways, we've also seen religion be used to harm other people. Maybe even we ourselves have been harmed, or loved ones that we care about have been harmed or abused because of religion. And we've just seen kind of the underbelly of religion, and many of us have had those experiences and are kind of skeptical about religion. So we tend to be a little cautious about religion. You say, well, that's kind of weird because you're a church. Yes, I get it. We are a church, but also skeptical about organized religion. The other word we use to describe ourselves is curious. We're a group that likes to ask a lot of questions, right? We have this notion that we don't have all the answers, that we haven't figured everything out yet. Even those of us who've been walking on this journey for quite a while still have questions. I've still got plenty of questions, and we actually think a big part of what it means to have faith is to be curious, to continue to ask questions, and even re-examine things that we thought were true before, to re-examine them and to constantly be thinking about these things. And we don't think that this curiosity or this question asking threatens God in any way. In fact, we think that a religion that can't be questioned can't be trusted. And so we think it's really healthy for religious groups, those who say they follow God, to be asking questions and being curious. So that's a little bit about us. Again, if you want to read a little bit more about us, you can go on our website and check things out. What we're doing today is we've been online last week and this week, online only, because obviously I don't have to explain this to you. Coronavirus is like everywhere, and people on our staff have been infected with COVID. Just everybody in the community seems to be infected with COVID right now. It just feels like I'm stunned when I meet someone who isn't sick. So we just thought it'd be safer, better, smarter, just to take a couple weeks here and pause. And people have asked, are we going to be meeting in person next week? And we haven't made that determination yet. We just said, hey, let's take 2 weeks and figure it out. And we'll make another determination this next week about what to do for this coming week. But what we're going to be doing in this online experience here today is a couple things. We're starting a new series today, which should be fun. I'm super pumped up and excited about it. But we're also going to do a couple other things. For instance, we're going to do a little singing now. Our worship leader, Billy, he's going to lead us in some singing. And there'll be 2 songs or so. In between's a little reflective video. And so he'll be leading us in that time together. And then after that, I'm going to come back and do the sermon and kind of share with you some stuff about the book of Ruth. And then we're going to conclude our time today with some communion. And obviously, when we're in person, we have things provided for you to take communion. But since we're all at home and we didn't mail out little communion kits to you, you can kind of find some elements that you want to use for communion if you want to participate in that today. So I would suggest maybe even right now is a good time to get up, go into the kitchen pantry there and find a piece of bread. You don't need a whole slice of bread. Just get a little chunk off of it. Or find some crackers, some wheat thins or something that you can use for the bread, which represents the body of Christ. And then also, if you need something for the cup, I would suggest some juice. It doesn't have to be grape juice. If you got some apple juice in your house, or maybe some wine left over from the night before, if you want to grab that, something to symbolize the body and the blood of Jesus. And we're going to carve out a time here online together that we can do communion today if you want to grab those elements together. Okay, we're going to be starting a new series here, but before we get into that, we want to kind of get our minds right. We want to kind of prepare ourselves. God is with us right now, wherever you are. It doesn't matter if you're on your couch or you're driving somewhere. God is there with you. The problem is we're not always aware that God is with us. And sometimes it takes us as humans a kind of a warm-up, to kind of ease into it, to this idea that God is with us. And so we're going to sing a little bit today, a little reflection video here. And the whole idea is it's to kind of ease us into the awareness of God being with us today. So Billy, why don't you take us away? We'll sing a couple songs here, and then we'll jump into our series that we're starting this week. All right, Billy, take it away.
Song of all songs is the song we sing. Song of our sounds having symphony. Songs of love to you from us all. Songs of praise, you're the one we adore. We're gonna sing out aloud as heaven is us and comes down in this day that we live. We'll show our love with such awesome praise. You are great and greatly to be praised. In all the earth, you are strong and powerful. In all the world, in all the heavens, you are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. Song of all songs is the song we sing. Sound of all sounds having symphony. Songs of love to you from us all. Songs of praise, you're the one we adore. We're gonna sing out aloud as heaven is us and comes down in this day that we live. We'll show our love with such awesome praise. You are great and greatly to be praised. In all the earth, you are strong and powerful. In all the world, in all the heaven, you are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. great. You are great, greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong, powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. You are great and greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong and powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. If my heart is so overwhelmed and I cannot hear your voice, I'll hold on to what is true, though I cannot see. If the storms of life they come, and the road ahead gets steep, I will lift these hands in faith, I will believe. I'll remind myself of all that you've done, and the life I have because of your Son. 'Cause love came down and rescued me, love came down and set me free, and I am yours, I am forever yours. Mountain high and valley low, I'll sing, I'll remind my soul that I am yours, I am forever yours. When my heart's filled with hope and every promise comes my way, when I feel your hands of grace rest upon me, staying desperate for you, God, staying humble at your feet, I will lift these hands in praise, I will believe. I'll remind myself of all that you've done, and the life I have because of your Son. 'Cause love came down and rescued me, love came down and set me free, and I am yours, I am forever yours. Mountain high and valley low, I'll sing, I'll remind my soul that I am yours, I am forever yours. 'Cause I am yours, I am yours, all my days, Jesus, I am yours. 'Cause I am yours, I am yours, all my days, Jesus, I am yours. 'Cause love came down and rescued me, love came down and set me free, I am yours, I am forever yours. Mountain high, valley low, I'll sing out, remind my soul that I am yours, I am forever yours. 'Cause love came down and rescued me, love came down and set me free, and I am yours, I am forever yours. Mountain high and valley low, I'll sing, I'll remind my soul that I am yours, I am forever yours. That I am yours, I am forever yours. That I am yours, I am forever yours.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled," and it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem. struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry two Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
All right, let's get started today. I was looking through the movie stuff, like on my TV, and I noticed that there is a new Matrix movie out. Did you see that? I mean, they made another one of those things, and my kids don't even know what the Matrix is. They haven't seen any of those. But I was telling them, like, this was like the first movie, The Matrix, that absolutely just blew my mind. I mean, do you remember that when you saw the first Matrix? I mean, I know the number 2 and number 3 were kind of lame, but the first Matrix movie was the first movie that just really blew my mind, because there's a twist that happens partway through it that I just didn't see coming. Normally I see things coming in movies, I can kind of predict what's happening, but The Matrix just blew my mind. And you remember that at one point, Neo, the main character, is offered a choice between a red pill or a blue pill, and if he takes the red pill, he is going to awaken to things all around him that he did not see before. But he can take the blue pill and he can just kind of stay asleep, and he'll never know the truth of what's happening. Life will just kind of go on status quo as usual. And you remember, of course, Neo chooses to take the red pill, and when he does, his mind is blown, but my mind was blown absolutely too. I mean, that movie took me by complete surprise. Well, there is a little book in the Bible that has really done the same thing in my life. I read this story and it's like I just took a red pill. I mean, I read it for years and years and I loved it, but I don't think I realized in reading it all those years how explosive and dangerous this little book actually is. I didn't realize how subversive it is. I didn't realize the claim it was making that was trying to reshape my entire life. And then one day I read the book and it completely detonated in my life and changed how I saw my own life, how I saw God, and how I saw others. Like a bomb just went off. This story exploded in my life in a way that it had never had, and I knew I wouldn't be the same. And that little story that I'm talking about is the story of Ruth. Now you say, that's weird. I've read Ruth before. I don't remember it being that edgy or subversive or dangerous or explosive. I know, okay? You've probably read the book of Ruth before, or you heard that little synopsis there, and it might kind of ring a little familiar because you're maybe partly aware of this story. It sounds like a nice romantic tale, but over the next few weeks, as we engage on this series, I think what you're going to discover are some new insights from this little book that might radically change how you think about life. We're calling the series Undocumented Love, Crossing Borders in the Book of Ruth, and we'll unpack a whole lot of why we've chosen this title as we go through the series. But probably you recognize that we don't normally think of Ruth as dangerous material. You know, we don't often handle the Book of Ruth like a live snake or as the explosive material that it is. Nobody has to put on a theological hazmat suit when they go to read the Book of Ruth. Although perhaps we should, because this is an explosive story. Now, I know we've often softened this story and avoided its detonation ability by framing it as sort of a well-known romantic love story. You know, we've kind of turned it into a Disney story of some kind, where the poor damsel in distress is waiting for her Prince Charming to show up and save the day. And as charming as that love story is, as we get into this thing, I think you'll see that this young damsel in distress isn't just sitting around waiting for her prince at all. But this story is much more fascinating, engaging, and challenging, even edgy, than it appears on the surface. But first, we need a little introduction to the story, because whenever we start a new series, we need an introduction to the material that we are reading, right? We're reading some stuff here that is thousands of years old, and we might need a little background info before we just jump straight into the story. In fact, I'm convinced that most of the mistakes that we make when reading our Bible is just choosing to read it without getting a lot of help on the outside of understanding the background of what we're going to read. And so often when we do a new series, we like to approach things from the perspectives of like a journalist, right? Good journalists, they're covering a story, they're going to ask your main questions, your W questions, right? The who, what, when, where, and why. Those are the basics any journalist needs to cover if they are going to report on a story. And since we are taking a look at this story, let's approach it for a moment as journalists and ask here our 5 W questions. And let's start with the what. What is this story? Well, the Book of Ruth, I mean, I'm going to call it the Book of Ruth, but it's not really a book, is it? I mean, it's a short story. If this book is printed on its own, it's just a couple pages long. Now, some people have actually called Ruth the greatest short story ever written. In other words, of course, it's Bible, but this thing is like literary art. It is an incredible piece of literary art on its own merits, part of the Bible or not. And you will be, as you engage this story and read it, I think you'll come to see that it is clearly put together by a very intelligent and skilled writer. So it is a beautiful short story, but it's also short. You could easily read this whole story in 15 minutes or less. In fact, I encourage you to do that. I suggest it. Read it. Open it up. If you've got a Bible at home, you can find, the story of Ruth in there. I'd love for you to read it. Just open it up. And in fact, it's best read in one sitting rather than just, little text here and there. And we'll kind of break it down that way in our times here. But I would just encourage you, sit down and read this short story, because when you read it, you just feel it. It hits you as you read it. It's one of the greatest short stories ever told. Okay, now that's the what. What about the when? Well, there's a couple things here when we talk about the when. First of all, there is the when does it take place, like in the context of the story, what is the background? And then also when was it written, because these are two different things. It's written, the when that it takes place is in one time period, and when it's actually written down is in another. Now, the setting for the story of Ruth, when the story takes place, is actually given to us in the very first sentence of the story. Ruth 1, verse 1 says that in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And this actually tells us a lot about the when. The author wants us to know that this story takes place in a certain time in Israel's history during the time of the judges. And this time of the judges is a time after the Israelites made it to the promised land. So it's post-Exodus. Remember, we just got done a little bit ago doing a series on Exodus. Moses rescues the people from Egypt, leads them to the promised land, right? So it's after that. But it's also before the rise of the kings like Saul and David and Solomon and the kings that come after them, right? This is a book that happens in between the arrival at the promised land and when the monarchy gets established. It's a story that happens during the time covered in the book of Judges. And what you need to know about this time is that Judges is an interesting book to read. You could read that as well. But what you need to know about this time period is it was a rather unpleasant time. In fact, it's described in the book of Judges as a time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And that's not really a ringing endorsement of a great society where everyone just kind of does what they see fit, right? It was a dangerous time with lots of violence and injustice. It was a very dangerous time. And in fact, the reason it's nice to know that backdrop is because Ruth itself becomes this incredible contrast to the awful setting in which it takes place. It shows a way to live this countercultural life that looks very different than the setting it's placed in. Okay, so that's the when of the setting it's placed in, but when was it written? Well, the short answer is we don't really know. Now, obviously, this story is written during, it's not written, rather, during the time that it actually takes place during the time of the judges, right? Because at the end of it, as the little video previously said, there is a genealogy describing how the people, the characters in the story, become part of the family lineage of King David, who lives later. So the story must have been written after King David lived, unless someone just added that on to the end of the story. Some people say, well, then maybe this story was written after the Babylonian exile. And part of the Old Testament, we think, was written after that, somewhere during the exile or after the exile. But it's unlikely that Ruth was written during this time because it contains some very, very old Hebrew language constructs that were not popular at that time. So it doesn't seem like a very good fit. So probably about the closest date we could say is somewhere during the early monarchy period after King David lived. Okay, so what about the who? Who wrote this short story? Well, I'm happy to tell you, no, I don't know. The truth is, we don't really know the answer to this one either. Now, an old Jewish tradition says that it was the prophet Samuel who wrote the book of Ruth. But it appears that that is the tradition simply because Samuel is the next book in the canon, right? 1st and 2nd Samuel. And so it's been attributed to Samuel the prophet. But there aren't almost any scholars today who take that tradition seriously. So we don't actually even know who wrote this story. In fact, though, it was probably an oral tale long before it was a written short story. In fact, some have suggested that this story of Ruth was a poem initially, or maybe even a poetic-like song. And we know that most of the biblical literature was told orally, out loud, before it was ever written down. And so perhaps that's true that this story was a song or a poem before it was written into a short story. And in fact, as you read through the book of Ruth, if you know Hebrew, you can see very distinctive, prominent, poetic elements in the story that don't come out in English, but you can see that they're preserved in Hebrew. So it may be that that is true. But we don't know who wrote it. We have this masterpiece short story and no one to attribute it to. Now, the where is kind of interesting. Where does this story take place? Well, obviously, it takes place mostly in Israel. The very first verses take place in Moab, and we'll learn where that is. But most of it takes place in Israel, which is probably also where it's written. But more specific than Israel, this story takes place in a town you've probably heard of. A little town called Bethlehem. O little town of Bethlehem. Yes, that Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. And long before Jesus, Bethlehem was famous for the events of this story. And so that is where our story takes place, in the city of Bethlehem. Now, why was this short story written? Well, perhaps we'll discover the point of this story, the why, as we go along, but I wouldn't want to ruin the surprise for you right now. Okay, so today we aren't going to read a lot of the text. We're going to read a few verses. But before we dive into the story, we need to sort of orient ourselves, kind of take an appraisal of what it is that we are about to read. What is this material? And so before we just jump into reading the story, we need some sort of introduction. And by the way, I'd just like to say thank you to the Bible Project people and for that video up front, just kind of giving us an overview of the whole book. It's a great intro little video, and they make those for really every book of the Bible. And so if you're looking for a good resource just to check out a book of the Bible and you want to learn a little bit more about a general overview of a book in the Bible, I would suggest looking up the Bible Project people and downloading any of their videos because they're really excellent in giving an overview of the video, of the book. But like The Matrix, Ruth's story invites us to take a red pill and see the world differently. And really, this is what makes the book of Ruth so fascinating and edgy. That it definitely gives us a new perspective on things, right? It opens us to an awareness or a perspective of things that we had not had probably before. And so before we even get into reading the story really in earnest, it's good to stop here for a minute and notice some red pills that will help us unlock the full beauty of this story. Okay? So are you ready here? I mean, there's a couple things even in the introduction here that sort of blow our mind as we start the book, or the short story of Ruth. And so I'm offering you a couple of red pills here. Are you ready to take them? Blue pill? No, red pill. Let's do the red pill. Let's be dangerous. The first one is this, that God is the center of the story. Now, it might not seem like that at first on the surface because we're going to meet all these main characters and you can read through the story. We're going to hear about these different people. But if you read through the story, you'll notice that God's name, Yahweh, is really only mentioned once. But for thousands and thousands of years, commentators and readers have noticed that though God's name is not mentioned very often, God is involved in every scene. He's behind the scenes. And so as we read the story, we want to be reading between the lines, so to speak, noticing God at work behind the scenes. Now, we're going to meet some really intriguing characters, right? We're going to meet Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, and people have tried to identify the main character of this story. And I think that in really significant ways, Naomi herself is actually sort of the main character of this story, not Ruth, after whom the story is even mentioned. But really, if we boil it all down, the main character of the story is God himself. And that's what I want you to see as we read this book, is that God's fingerprints are all over this story. Like our lives today, we may not see directly where God is active, but Ruth tells us the story of a God who is always there, behind the scenes, working through people to accomplish his good work. And so when you read this story, it is daring you to see the God between each sentence and stanza, to read between the lines and see God. Now, it's a story with God involved, but it's also a story really with God as the main subject. It's a story that is exploring the realities of God. You see, this story isn't really a romantic tale. It's a story about God. And the question here is God reliable? It is God's character that is on the line in the book of Ruth. In other words, can God be trusted? Is God faithful? even when things are falling apart? Does he care about people whom society has given up on? What kind of God is this Yahweh? These are the types of questions that the characters are asking, and it puts the very nature of God on full display. He is absolutely the center of this story. But if God is the center of the story, the view or the perspective that we get from God is from the margins. And that is another huge red pill to take as we engage in this journey through the story of Ruth. God is at the center, but the perspective of God is from the margins. You see, the question is, what does faith in God look like if you live on the borders of society? And the story of Ruth is a story about immigrants, famine refugees, those poor enough to need welfare assistance. It's a story about the ultimate poor and vulnerable widows and foreigners. And this story gives us a glimpse into what God looks like from that vantage point. Is God there too? Does God care only for those on the inside, or does he care for those on the down and out too? Now, what we're going to discover in the book of Ruth, that there are all sorts of borders and barriers in this story. And these borders are not easy to cross. There are borders of race and religion and gender and economic status and nationality and influence and power. And the question is, what does life look like? What does God look like when you are on the outer edges of those borders? Now, speaking about the margins, that brings us to Naomi herself. Naomi is the critical person who experiences crisis in this story. And what you need to know from the very beginning here is that Naomi, and really this story of Ruth here, but Naomi herself is a female version of Job. You remember Job? This is kind of a big point here, and it's sort of mind-blowing to me once I saw it, right? You remember Job in the Bible? There's another story about a man named Job. He's a guy who is powerful, he's loaded, he's got all sorts of money, he has everything going his way, he's favored by God, and then one day, everything is taken away from him. His whole family dies, and he loses everything. And he calls out to God in frustration. And he says, why are you mad at me? Why have you done this to me? What have I done? And it's a book, Job is, wrestling with where is God when everything goes bad. And there are tons of parallels with our story here in Ruth. Because Naomi is the female version of Job. And the opening scene of the story tells how Naomi, just like Job, loses everything. So let's read a part of the opening of the story here. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Okay, so here we meet most of the main characters. And just like an episode of Game of Thrones, many of the main characters are killed off in the first 5 verses. You think, wait, hold on a second here. I barely got to know Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, the father and the 2 sons, and they're dead already? I mean, it kind of sounds like, as you open the story, that this story might be about at least Elimelech as a main character, but he's killed off right away. And these opening verses describe a terrible set of tragedies that leave Naomi emptied of everything. She experiences a famine, which causes her to move out of Bethlehem, move to a foreign land, Moab, where she is now a refugee, where they resettle with the family. But then as they live there, her husband dies, and then they continue to live there, but both of her sons die, and she loses everything. And the parallels to Job are actually pretty stunning. Both of them, for instance, lose everything. Job loses livestock, children, and his health. Naomi endures famine, life of a refugee, the deaths of her husband and her sons. I mean, and for her, that's a big deal, and we'll talk about why losing the males in her life is a big deal. But what you have to understand is this is a total wipeout for both sufferers, Job and Naomi. The only difference is that in a patriarchal society, Job can rebuild, while Naomi, a post-menopausal widow, is pretty well finished. And we'll talk more on that later. But both of them have a complete loss. Another parallel. Both of them blame God for their circumstances. Now, sure, there are secondary causes. Like, for instance, for Job, there was an attack from raiders. There was lightning from the sky. There was a windstorm, that took everything away from him. And for Naomi, there was a famine. There was life as a refugee. There was the death of her family, her husband, her sons from, well, we're not exactly told, but something kills them off, right? But for both of these people, even though there's secondary causes for their trouble, they both move beyond those secondary causes and move to something deeper and think, well, God must have allowed this. And so they cry out to God. Job questions God's justice. Naomi questions God's love and his loyalty. And this is a huge theme of both stories. For both, God's goodness is on the line. Now, both are also met by friends who can hardly recognize them anymore after all they've been through. Remember, Job had some friends who offered some advice to him. Turned out to be pretty bad advice, actually. But Naomi, we'll discover in the story, meets up with friends too who can hardly recognize her anymore after all that she has been through. And then, of course, at the end of both stories, there is a reversal of fortunes. In the book of Job, everything is taken from him at the beginning, and at the end, everything is restored. In Naomi's story here, everything is taken from her at the beginning, and we'll see this reversal in the end where everything is sort of returned in a new way. They get their life back. And so in both stories, God responds to each in a way that strengthens or revives their faith, even though in both stories, God never explains why these tragic things happened in the first place. Neither Job nor Naomi are ever given a reason for why they went through such terrible circumstances. But they are both shown the love and faithfulness of God in a way that renews them. They sort of have a resurrection type moment, both for Job and for Naomi. And we'll get to see that. Now, this is actually an important little insight into this book when we begin to see this story here as the female story of Job. Because once we begin to approach this book from this perspective, we see that this isn't a story about a magic fairy tale romance and wedding. It's a story actually wrestling with the questions of, is God faithful when bad things happen? And that is an entirely different book. And I dare say, just reading this little story with that one thing in mind will change its impact for you. This story is trying to give you a glimpse of what it looks like to trust God when you are on the margins. And most of us today in the United States are not. We view God from a cozy position in a very privileged vantage point. Sure, we go through some hard times too. But this story gives us a view of what it's like to trust God when you are the absolute poorest of the poor, when you are lost, when you are hungry, not knowing where you're going to get your next meal, when you are forgotten and left out by society, when you are an illegal alien, when you are on the welfare rolls. And it is a view of God from a place that perhaps you've never been, but it is a perspective I promise you need. Now, the second to last pill here that we're going to notice is that this is a foreign story, okay? In other words, this story, and well, actually every story in the Bible, is not an American story. It is not a Western mindset story, okay? We are Western, we are American, the Bible isn't. Okay, so that might be obvious, but I'm not sure we always fully approach our Bible texts and stories with this firmly in mind. These stories are written by people living on the other side of the world thousands of years ago with different thoughts completely about how life works than us. They have different customs, they have different values, they have different assumptions, they have different interests, frankly, and they have different beliefs than us. In fact, they don't even understand science like we do, and that one thing alone is a huge difference from our worldview. And to pick up any book in the Bible and read it without intentionally considering these worldview differences leads us to making unconscious assumptions that affect the very meaning of the Bible text. In her little book on Ruth, Carolyn Custis James, she says this: as Westerners, we study the Bible at a huge disadvantage. Let's pause there for a second. She's saying, as Westerners, we are at a disadvantage. Now, I know that in many things in life, as Americans, as Westerners, we are at a huge advantage. But when it comes to studying the Bible, she's pointing out we're at a huge disadvantage. Why? For our culture is far removed from the world of the Bible as we can get in today's world. Without significant outside help, we will distort, diminish, or miss entirely the message of the story. And she is absolutely right. I mean, I contend that's exactly how we've turned this tale that is as audacious and subversive as the story of Ruth into something as domesticated as a romantic love story. And the reason that happened is because we failed to fully appreciate how foreign this story is, and we've turned it into something that looks like our modern Western stories of romance, but we miss a whole lot when we do. We take away the power that this story has. Now, the main thing that we'll want to notice in this story that has to do with it being so foreign from our world is something we call the patriarchy. And Carolyn Custis James gives us a great quote here on what is the patriarchy. Patriarchy is a social system that privileges men over women, where the actions of men command focus, and women, with few exceptions, recede into the background. Under patriarchy, a woman derives her value from men, her father, husband, and especially her sons. Sons are patriarchy's gold standard for determining the value of a woman. That standard of measurement has a devastating impact on Naomi and Ruth. Okay, that's the patriarchy, right? This idea that women get their value from the men in their life. And you say, well, okay, doesn't the patriarchy still exist today in our culture? Well, sure, but in American context, we live today with not the overt effects of patriarchy quite as noticeable as in the story of Ruth. The patriarchy still affects life today. In our culture, women's lives are affected, but it's in more subtle ways. For instance, we know that women today still don't get paid nearly the same amount as men doing the same job. And that is a subtle effect of patriarchy. In the church, right? There's many churches today where women can't be pastors and teachers and leaders because they're women, and that is an effect of the patriarchy. So we still feel the effects of patriarchy in our culture today. But in the story of Ruth, patriarchy is prominent and overt. Both Moab and Israel are very patriarchal cultures where women have little to no value without the men in their life. They can't own property, they can't make a living, or have hope for pretty much any sort of life away from poverty and sex trafficking if they aren't surrounded by men. And this is markedly different from our world today. Now, why bring this up? Why does it matter? Because I want you to see this idea of patriarchy is the backdrop of the story of Ruth. It is the backdrop, but it is not the message of the story. The whole Bible has patriarchy as its context and backdrop, but that is not an endorsement of patriarchy. It's a description of the times back then, not a prescription for our time today. And there is a big difference between those two things. In fact, what we're going to discover here is that the book of Ruth is actually in large part a critique of the patriarchy. It is the description of what happens when the kingdom of God breaks into a fallen culture marked by patriarchy, and all the injustice that exists there is a story that is laying out for us a countercultural way of living in the middle of a culture steeped in patriarchy. And so you should actually feel the criticism of patriarchy in literally every scene of this book. And that makes it sort of unique and dangerous. Because there are still people today who want to hold on to that fallen backdrop rather than embrace the new way of the kingdom of God instead. And here's this little story right in the middle of your Bible that dares to challenge the patriarchy and its rules, that dares to break the rules. And that is the final red pill in the book of Ruth, that we discover a love that breaks all the rules. And you say, hold on a second here. Keeping the rules is something that good people do. I'm a rule follower. Religion and society have rules, and I'm a good person for keeping the rules. Okay. But sometimes love requires that you break the rules. And that is the real danger and contention of this story. That is what is so explosive. It endorses a type of love that is willing to break some rules. And that type of love, well, it's pretty risky. The main theme of this story is clearly love. In fact, it is the main word of the book of Ruth. And we're going to get to this word and we'll explain it, but it's a Hebrew word, chesed. And hesed will unpack a lot going forward. But you should know that this hesed, love, is not a romantic love. There are other words in Hebrew for that, but hesed is a radically other-centered love. It has really little to do with romantic feelings, but it is a love that is fiercely loyal and sacrificial and unrelenting. It is a love that will not stop, and it will spare no expense to do what is best for the other. A love that will break all the rules if the rules don't meet the person's need. This is a story of a couple who is individually and together conspiring to get into trouble together, to do what is best, even if they have to reinterpret all the rules. And we're going to discover that they do just that. They get into a good kind of trouble. You remember that phrase? It was a phrase that John Lewis used, talking about voting rights for Black Americans and what we should be willing to do in order to make sure that life was equal for all, when there are people on the margins, when injustice is being done. He advised us to risk getting into good trouble, getting into trouble for the benefit of others. And of course, John Lewis's good friend, Martin Luther King Jr., is a good picture of the type of subversive commitment to this kind of love. I mean, it's probably appropriate that this is Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and we are starting this book on Ruth, because Dr. King was someone who was willing to risk trouble. he engaged in this type of dangerous, subversive, explosive love. He would go to marches and he would march, or he would sit in even places he was told not to. And because of these actions, he was thrown in jail and beaten. And ultimately, he was killed. But he would break the rules in subversive ways in order to force change. And what would cause a man to do this? Well, Dr. King was driven by a sense of love for God. Remember, he was a preacher. That's who Dr. King was first and foremost, a preacher. And he saw what he did as just the natural expression of what it meant to follow Jesus, to love God with all his mind, with all his heart, with all his soul. He was motivated by a sense of love for those on the margins who were left out. And he was motivated by a sense of love even for his own enemies, because he believed that doing the right thing was best even for the people that stood against him. He lived a counter-cultural type of life that demanded change by how he lived. And that is the type of story that we are about to read. A dangerous tale of a love that is willing to break the rules and get in trouble for the benefit of another person. And Ruth is a poor, female, refugee, undocumented alien who is on welfare. And she walks into the story of the Bible and gives us a daring example of this kind of chesed love. A non-Jewish woman, she reinterprets and reimagines Jewish law in a new way that we are going to discover breaks all the established rules. This story is a story for rule breakers. Carolyn Custis James, she says this: Mosaic laws get broken in Bethlehem. And when they do, a whole new realm of possibilities opens up for what it means to live as God's child, revealing a radical way of being human in relationships with others. Bethlehem's greatness can be traced to the healthy kind of rule breaking that results when God's people use their imaginations to pursue the spirit of the law. Bethlehem, the town of love that breaks the rules. That's its history. Old Bethlehem, where the rules get broken by love. You know, sometimes this story of Ruth is called the Gospel of Ruth, because this edgy story points us directly to Jesus. And this story takes place right in the town of his birth, where God broke all the rules and became a human being. Where he was born and then lived a life breaking all the religious rules if they kept people from finding healing and wholeness. This story, it points us right to Jesus. And if you'll hang in there, if you'll read this story with us, I have a feeling that this story of Ruth is about to shake up your worldview. It did mine. But I'll encourage you, lean into it. Allow the detonation of this bomb. Take the red pill. Allow this story from the Bible to give you a new perspective on who God is and how you can partner with him in changing the world. And I don't know, if you're feeling on the margins today, may this book be a good reminder that you can always find refuge in God. Let's pray today. Hey, God, thank you so much that you speak to us through these strange stories. We're thankful that this story of Ruth has been preserved in the Bible for all these years. We're thankful that we can engage with this story and discover you behind the scenes. We're looking forward to whatever it is you want to do in us and through us as we read this story. I'm praying as we begin this series, God, that you would kind of explode into our world here in a way that we haven't seen before, that like Neo taking the red pill, that all of a sudden we'd become aware of perspectives of things that we never saw before, that we could maybe even learn about you from the perspectives of people who live on the margins. We thank you, Jesus, that you have broken all the rules with love, that no rule can contain the power of love. And we trust in you today. We lay aside every rule we've ever had in order to embrace your way of love, which fulfills all the law. We love you, Jesus. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. I'm so excited to get going on this series. Can't wait to next week so we dive into the text and read a little bit more about it. I think it's going to really transform how you see this book and how you see life and your participation in it. Today we want to participate in something else, communion. We want to go to the communion table now. Billy's going to lead us in a time of communion, and as he plays this song, we just want to invite you, if you've got some of those elements at home to partake of communion together, you can do that. Bring those out and take communion, or if you just want to sing along or quietly pray and meditate, that's fine too. And then when that's over, I'll come back and give us some announcements for today. Okay, let's go to communion.
I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. Sing that again. I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up till I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire in darkest night. You are close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. I have lived in the goodness of God. Yeah, yeah. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. In my life laid down, surrender now. I'll give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I'm gonna sing, I'm gonna sing. All my life you have been faithful, and all my life you have been so, so good. You are. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. And I will sing of the goodness of God. Oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. I will sing of the goodness of God.
All right, amen. Thanks, Billy. That was great. Appreciate that. I want to give you a couple announcements as we wrap up here. First of all, I don't know where we're going to be next week. We're always online, so whether we're in person or not, we're always online here. So if you're here today, you can come back and hang out with us next week too. Next Sunday at 10 a.m. we'll be live streaming again, same time. As for in-person stuff, we're going to kind of just take a look at some stuff here this week, and we'll send out an email and post everything on Facebook and Twitter and TikTok or Instagram, I don't know, everywhere, just to let people know what we're doing this week. Thanks for your patience in that. We just want to make sure that we're doing the most responsible thing we can do to help people stay safe. If you'd like to give, you can do that. You can donate to the Pathways Church community and help support what we do by going to the website at findpathways.com/donate. You can set up a one-time gift or a recurring gift if you'd like to do that. And there's so many of you that are giving and donating in order to support this church community, even through a global pandemic. You guys have been so faithful in that, and we want to thank you for doing that. And if you'd like to kind of partner with us and kind of put some skin in the game, so to speak, you can do that today by joining us in giving online. Also, another thing you can do is today we're going to do our online foyer again, and we did this last week since we haven't had a chance to be in person last week or today. We're going to do a little Zoom call here right as we get done, and the number for the Zoom and the password are on the screen here. We'd love for you to join us. We're going to have it open for about 45 minutes, but you can pop on even for 5 minutes, for 2 minutes, if you want to just show your face for a second and just say, hey, here I am. It's nice to see everybody. Then we would love to have you do that. And as soon as this live stream ends, that thing's going to start, and it'll take me a moment to migrate over, but I'll be there as well. And so we'd love to have you join us if you want to do that. Also, if you aren't already on our email newsletter, we would love to add you to our list. We don't spam things out all the time. We don't even send it out every week just because we know you get a ton of emails all the time. But when we have stuff going on, we want to let you know about it. And so email is one easy way to do that. And if you aren't on the newsletter already, you can message us on Facebook and tell us your name and email address, or my email's on the screen there if you want to take a screenshot of this and then email me and say, hey, add me to the newsletter. We'd love to make sure and do that as well. Okay, that's pretty much it. Next week, I promise you, we're going to read a little bit more of the story of Ruth. We're going to get into it, and some of these things that we kind of just covered as overview today, you're going to start to see them playing out in the story itself. And it's really a beautiful telling of this story that really calls us to action. You're going to see people in the story taking risks to love people with a faithful kind of love. You're going to see God acting with a faithful kind of love, and it is going to elicit out of us a sense that we need to be living our lives with this kind of dangerous, subversive, unending love. So anyway, next week we'll be jumping into the story a little bit more. Hope that you come back and join us for that. Okay, have a great week. We'll see you next time. Bye.